I've been staring at this blank page for 3 hours now, and my hands won't stop shaking long enough to write a decent sentence. The doctors keep telling me it's just trauma response, that my body needs time to readjust after what they're calling a severe decompression incident. They don't know what really happened down there. Hell, I'm not even sure I know what happened down there. But I have to get this down before they pump me full of more sedatives, or before I start second-guessing what I saw with my own eyes. 22 years of deep-sea research, and I've never experienced anything that comes close to what we encountered in the Mariana Trench. The problem is, once I finish writing this, no one's going to believe a word of it. My name is Grayson Griffin, and I've been leading deep water expeditions since I was 25 years old. Started in the North Sea working oil rigs, moved to research vessels when I got tired of corporate bureaucracy telling me how to do my job. I've seen things down there that would give most people nightmares. Bioluminescent creatures that look like they crawled out of alien worlds, geological formations that shouldn't exist according to textbooks, pressure environments that can crush a human body in milliseconds. The ocean doesn't care about your experience or your safety protocols. It'll kill you just as easily on your 1000th dive as your first. That's why I was suspicious when Timothy Graves approached me about this expedition. Timothy worked for some government marine research division, never could get a straight answer about which department exactly, and he had this way of talking around details that made my skin crawl. Tall guy, always wore those wire-rimmed glasses and kept adjusting them when he was nervous, which was pretty much constantly during our planning meetings. "We need someone with your experience for a sample collection mission," he'd said, spreading charts across my kitchen table like he was planning a military operation. Specific coordinates in the Hadal Zone, mineral deposits that could revolutionize deep-sea mining. I'd looked at the coordinates and felt my stomach drop. The deepest part of the Mariana Trench, nearly 7 miles down where the pressure could flatten a car into a pancake. What kind of minerals are we talking about? Timothy had shuffled through his papers, not meeting my eyes. Rare earth elements, possibly some compounds we haven't cataloged yet. That should have been my first red flag. In 22 years, I'd learned to spot when someone was feeding me a line, and Timothy was practically choking on his own bullshit. But the money was good. Better than good, actually. And I needed the work. My last expedition had been 6 months ago, and the bills don't stop coming just because you're between jobs. The team Timothy assembled was solid, I'll give him that. Dean James had been piloting submersibles longer than some of these kids had been alive, and he knew the revelation better than anyone. Compact guy with steady hands and this weird fascination with electromagnetic readings that most pilots would ignore. Dean had this habit of humming old blues songs when he was concentrating, and I'd worked with him enough times to know that when the humming stopped, something was wrong. Chad McGuire was our marine biologist, fresh-faced Irish kid who couldn't sit still for more than 5 minutes without checking his equipment. His accent got thicker when he was nervous, which was most of the time, but he knew his stuff. Had some groundbreaking research on extremophile bacteria that nobody in the scientific community wanted to take seriously. I felt bad for the kid. Reminded me of myself at that age, trying to prove I belonged in rooms full of people with twice my experience. Then there was Ivy Nelson, 26 years old, just finished her doctorate, and smart enough to make the rest of us feel like we were moving underwater. Korean American, always had her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. And she approached every problem like it was a puzzle she could solve if she just thought about it hard enough. Ivy had this way of getting excited about discoveries that reminded me why I'd gotten into this work in the first place, back before I'd seen enough accidents to know that the ocean doesn't care about your enthusiasm. We spent 2 weeks prepping the Revelation at the research station. Standard deep-sea submersible, rated for depths that would crush most vessels, with enough life support for 12 hours and emergency systems that could keep us alive for another 6 if everything went to hell. Timothy kept hovering around during our equipment checks, asking questions about our electromagnetic sensors and sonar capabilities that had nothing to do with mineral collection. "You planning on mapping the sea floor while we're down there?" I'd asked him during one particularly annoying session where he'd insisted we calibrate our instruments 3 times. "Just want to make sure we don't miss anything important," he'd said, adjusting those damn glasses again. The night before our descent, I'd found Timothy in the equipment bay at 2 in the morning, going through a folder marked with classifications I didn't recognize. When he saw me, he'd shoved the papers back into his briefcase like a kid caught with stolen candy. "Couldn't sleep," he'd said. "Just reviewing the mission parameters. Mineral collection doesn't usually require classified documentation." Timothy had looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing how much truth he wanted to share. "There have been some unusual readings from this area. Magnetic anomalies. We want to be prepared for anything we might encounter." That was the closest he'd come to honesty during the entire planning phase, and it still felt like he was holding back the important parts. But I'd signed the contracts, and my team was ready to go. In this business, you learn to work with incomplete information and hope your experience can fill in the gaps. I should have trusted my instincts and walked away right then. Should have told Timothy to find another expedition leader, someone who didn't have enough experience to smell the lies underneath his careful explanations. But the money was too good, and I'd been doing this long enough to think I could handle whatever surprises were waiting for us down there. 22 years of deep-sea research, and I'd never been more wrong about anything in my life. The electromagnetic pulses started as whispers through our instruments. Little blips that Dean noticed first because he pays attention to things the rest of us usually ignore. 2 hours down, 15,000 feet of crushing darkness above us, and our sensors were picking up something that had no business being there. "Getting some weird readings," Dean said, his usual humming replaced by focused silence. "Electromagnetic activity, regular intervals like a heartbeat." I leaned over his shoulder to check the displays. The pulses showed up as clean spikes every 37 seconds, way too consistent to be natural. "Equipment malfunction?" "Ran diagnostics twice. Everything's working fine." Dean's hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, keeping our descent steady while the Revelation's hull creaked under the increasing pressure. "Whatever's down there is putting out a signal." Chad had his face pressed to his biological monitoring station, frowning at readings that clearly weren't making sense. "This is bizarre. I'm showing almost 0 life signs in the water column. At this depth, we should be swimming through clouds of bacteria and microorganisms, but it's like everything's just gone." "Maybe they adapted," Ivy said, practically vibrating with excitement as she recorded everything. "Electromagnetic fields can affect biological systems. Whatever's generating these pulses might have created an environment where normal deep-sea life can't survive, so the organisms that are here evolved completely different survival mechanisms." I watched her scribble notes with the kind of enthusiasm that reminded me why I'd gotten into this work before I'd learned to be suspicious of everything. But something about Timothy's behavior was setting off every alarm bell I'd developed over 22 years of expeditions where people lied about what we were really looking for. He sat hunched over a manila folder I'd never seen during our planning sessions, reading through what looked like official reports with classification stamps across the top. When he noticed me watching, he tried to close the folder casually, but I'd already seen enough to know he'd been holding back information. "Timothy." My voice carried the kind of authority that made younger team members straighten up. "What's in the folder?" He adjusted his glasses, that nervous tell that meant he was about to feed me another line. "Just additional research parameters. Nothing that affects our mission." "Bullshit." I moved closer, and the cramped confines of the revelation meant he couldn't avoid me. "We're getting electromagnetic readings that don't match anything in the geological surveys you showed us. Chad's seeing biological anomalies that suggest this area's been altered somehow, and you're reading classified documents. So let's try this again. What's really down there?" Timothy looked around at the rest of the team, weighing how much truth he could get away with. Dean kept his eyes on the controls, but I could tell he was listening. Chad and Ivy had stopped their monitoring to watch our confrontation. "There have been 2 previous expeditions to these coordinates," Timothy said finally. "Both experienced equipment failures and had to abort their missions before reaching the target depth. Equipment failures you didn't think were worth mentioning during our briefing? The failures were attributed to pressure-related malfunctions, standard deep-sea risks." I held out my hand. "Let me see the reports." Timothy hesitated, then passed me the folder. The documents inside made my stomach drop. Both previous teams had reported the same electromagnetic pulses we were experiencing, followed by complete communication blackouts and navigation system failures. One team's final transmission mentioned geometric structures inconsistent with known geological formations before their radio went dead. Jesus Christ, Timothy. These teams barely made it back alive, and you thought this was information we didn't need? "The potential discovery justifies the risks," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. 6 months ago, deep penetration sonar detected a massive structure on the trench floor, something that shouldn't exist at these depths. The electromagnetic pulses were getting stronger, making our instruments flicker with each wave. Dean's humming had stopped completely, which meant he was worried about something he wasn't saying out loud. "What kind of structure?" Ivy asked, her excitement overriding any concern about the risks Timothy had hidden from us. "Geometric, artificial, roughly 3 miles in diameter." Chad looked up from his biological sensors, his face pale. 3 miles. That's bigger than most cities. "Which is why we need to document it properly," Timothy said. "The previous teams didn't have the right equipment or expertise. We do." I wanted to order Dean to abort the mission right then, but we were already committed. At this depth, emergency ascent procedures would take 18 hours minimum, and our life support was calculated for a full mission duration. Going back now would mean we'd used up our safety margins for nothing. 20,000 feet, Dean announced. "Electromagnetic interference is getting stronger. I'm losing intermittent contact with our surface support." The pulses were coming every 20 seconds now, and each one made the Revelation's lights flicker. Through the viewports, the water looked different somehow, clearer than it should be at this depth, with an almost crystalline quality that didn't match anything I'd seen in 2 decades of deep-sea work. 25,000 feet. Communication systems are down completely. Timothy was studying his classified reports like they contained answers to questions he hadn't asked yet. The previous teams lost communications at approximately this depth. It's expected. Expected by who? I demanded. Because nobody told the rest of us to expect anything except a routine sample collection mission. 28,000 feet, Dean said, approaching the trench floor. He activated our external floodlights, and the beams cut through the crystal-clear water to illuminate something that made everyone in the Revelation go completely silent. The ocean floor wasn't rock or sediment, or the biological muck you'd expect at these depths. It was metal. Perfectly smooth, metallic surface that stretched beyond our lights in every direction, covered with intricate geometric patterns that looked like they'd been carved by something with mathematical precision and artistic sensibility that had nothing to do with natural geological processes. "Holy shit," Chad whispered. Dean brought us closer, and the scale of what we were seeing became clear. The geometric patterns weren't random decorations. They were organized into complex designs that repeated and interconnected across the metallic surface like a massive circuit board or architectural blueprint. Some patterns looked almost familiar, like mathematical concepts I'd seen in textbooks, while others hurt to look at directly because they seemed to bend in directions that shouldn't exist. "This isn't a natural formation," Ivy said, her voice filled with awe and something that might have been fear. "This is constructed, designed. But by what?" I turned to Timothy, who was staring at the structure like he'd expected to find it, but hadn't prepared himself for the reality of seeing it. "How long have you known about this?" The sonar readings suggested something artificial, but we couldn't be certain without visual confirmation. "Don't give me that bureaucratic bullshit. You've been planning this discovery mission for months, haven't you? The mineral collection story was just cover to get us down here." Timothy met my eyes, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely honest. "Yes. But Grayson, if this is what I think it is, it could change everything we understand about deep-sea archaeology, about human history itself." Dean was piloting us along the edge of the structure, and our lights revealed that it extended far beyond what we could see. Miles of metallic surface covered in those impossible geometric patterns, sitting on the ocean floor like it had been there for centuries or millennia. "The electromagnetic pulses are coming from directly below us," Dean reported. "Whatever this thing is, it's active." I stared down at the structure and felt something I'd never experienced in 22 years of deep-sea research. The absolute certainty that we were looking at something that human beings were never meant to find. The geometric patterns were moving. I blinked hard, thinking the pressure might be getting to me. But when I looked again through the viewport, there was no mistaking it. The intricate designs carved into the metallic surface were slowly shifting, rearranging themselves like pieces of some massive puzzle, solving itself. "Ivy, are you seeing this?" She pressed closer to her monitoring station, her earlier excitement replaced by something that looked like concern. "The patterns are definitely changing configuration. It's like they're responding to our presence." Chad's voice cracked slightly. "My biological sensors aren't picking up any life signs, but something down there is definitely active. The electromagnetic readings are off the charts." I turned to Timothy, who was still clutching that classified folder like it contained the secrets of the universe. "All right, enough games. What the hell are we really looking for down here?" Timothy adjusted his glasses, but this time the nervous gesture looked different, less like he was buying time to construct a lie and more like he was deciding how much truth he could handle sharing. "Dr. Carson Robinson," he said finally. "Deep-sea archaeologist. He's been theorizing about very old structures in ocean trenches for years. Non-human structures. Theorizing or finding? Both." Timothy opened the folder and pulled out what looked like personal correspondence rather than official reports. "Carson and I have been in contact for the past 18 months. His research suggested that certain deep ocean formations weren't geological at all, but constructed by something that predates human civilization by thousands of years." Dean's humming had stopped completely. "Where's this Carson guy now?" Timothy's pause lasted too long. "He disappeared on a solo dive 3 years ago. His last transmission described finding something he called an eye that looked back at him. The patterns below us were moving faster now, the geometric designs flowing like liquid metal across the surface." Dean adjusted our position, following the edge of the structure, and the scale of what we were seeing became clear. This thing stretched for miles in every direction, far beyond what our lights could illuminate. "This is bigger than Manhattan," Ivy whispered. "How is something this massive just sitting on the ocean floor without anyone knowing about it?" Because it's 7 miles down in the deepest part of the ocean, I said. And because the few people who found it either don't come back or come back telling stories nobody wants to believe. Chad was frantically adjusting his instruments. The electromagnetic pulses are getting stronger. Whatever's powering this thing, it's ramping up activity. Dean piloted us along what seemed to be the structure's perimeter, revealing more of its impossible scope. The geometric patterns weren't random decorations. They were organized into complex networks that connected and branched like neural pathways or circuit boards designed by something with mathematical understanding that made human engineering look like children's blocks. There, Ivy pointed through the viewport. The patterns are all converging toward that central area. About half a mile ahead, the flowing geometric designs were moving toward a circular formation, roughly 300 feet in diameter. As we approached, the constant motion of the patterns began to slow, then stopped entirely. The electromagnetic activity just ceased, Chad reported. Complete silence. The circular area had become perfectly smooth, like a massive lens or mirror embedded in the metallic surface. Dean brought us directly over it, and our lights reflected off the polished surface with an intensity that made us all squint. "Look at the reflection," Ivy said, her voice barely above a whisper. I stared down at the mirror-like surface, expecting to see the Revelation's hull reflected back at us. Instead, the reflection showed something else entirely, something organic and alive that made my skin crawl. It was an eye. Massive, easily 300 feet across, with an iris that looked distinctly non-human. The pupil was elongated rather than round, and the iris itself seemed to be made of overlapping scales, or plates, that shifted with subtle, breathing-like movements. "That's not our reflection," Dean said, stating the obvious, because none of us could quite process what we were seeing. Chad's instrument suddenly spiked. "I'm getting readings now. Massive biological activity directly below us." The eye in the reflection blinked. Timothy leaned forward, his face pale but his eyes bright with the kind of terrible excitement that comes from having your worst theories confirmed. Carson was right. We found something that came before human civilization. Something that's been waiting down here for thousands of years. The low-frequency vibration started as a barely perceptible hum, but within seconds it had grown strong enough that we could feel it through the Revelation's hull. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, resonating through the water and into our bones. "It knows we're here," Ivy said. The eye in the reflection was definitely looking at us now, the alien iris contracting and expanding like it was trying to focus on our submersible. The vibration grew stronger, and I realized with growing horror that what we were hearing wasn't just sound. It was communication. The iris contracted like a camera lens focusing, and suddenly the eye wasn't just 300 feet across anymore. It was expanding, growing larger as we watched. Or maybe we were getting pulled closer. I couldn't tell which was worse. "Dean, get us out of here. Now." He was already working the controls, but his face had gone pale. "Engines aren't responding. Nothing's responding." The organic-looking iris tightened with mechanical precision, and I could see layers of scaled plates shifting beneath the surface like some impossible biological aperture. The thing was definitely focusing on us now, studying us with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. Timothy dropped his classified folder, papers scattering across the cramped cabin as he lunged for his instrument panel. "The electromagnetic readings are off the charts. Whatever this thing is, it's powering up." "Timothy." My voice carried 22 years of authority and barely controlled anger. "You brought us here on purpose. You knew about this thing." He didn't deny it this time. His hands shook as he pulled out more documents from inside his jacket. Personal correspondence, not official reports. Carson's research suggested this entity might be connected to several missing deep-sea expeditions over the past decade. The Nereid in 2019, the Cousteau III in 2021, the research vessel Hadal Explorer last year. Missing expeditions you forgot to mention during our briefing? They weren't just missing. Some of them came back, but the crews... Timothy's voice trailed off as he found what he was looking for. Handwritten testimonies that looked like they'd been copied from psychiatric evaluations. The survivors described being taken by something in the deep, pulled into what they called a collection. Chad's biological sensors started screaming, alarms blaring as readings spiked beyond anything his equipment was designed to measure. Massive biological activity. This thing isn't just alive, it's ancient. The cellular structures I'm detecting shouldn't be possible. The eye was definitely bigger now, easily 500 feet across, and I realized with growing horror that it wasn't expanding. We were being pulled toward it. The smooth metallic surface around the eye had started to curve inward, creating a depression that funneled down toward the center. Dean, emergency thrusters, everything we've got. Already tried. The water's acting like it's thick as molasses. We're not moving. Ivy pressed her face to the viewport, her earlier excitement replaced by something that looked like terror mixed with fascination. Look at the center. The pupil isn't empty. She was right. What I'd thought was a black void in the center of the eye was actually something else entirely. A swirling vortex of water and light that seemed to spiral down into impossible depths. The movement was hypnotic, like staring into a whirlpool that bent light in directions that hurt to follow. "It's not just an eye," Ivy whispered. "It's a gateway." The revelation lurched forward suddenly, pulled by a current that hadn't been there seconds before. Dean fought the controls, but we were caught in something that had nothing to do with normal ocean physics. Chad stumbled backward from his monitoring station. "The pressure readings are going insane. We're showing crushing depth 1 second, surface pressure the next. This is impossible." Timothy was frantically shuffling through his papers, looking for something specific. Carson's final transmission mentioned coordinates. He was trying to tell someone on the surface exactly where this thing was located. "Someone who knew what was happening," I said, the pieces finally clicking together. This wasn't a research mission. This was a rescue operation. The vortex in the center of the eye was pulling us in now, and I could see other things caught in the same spiraling current. Metal debris that looked like pieces of submersibles, chunks of hull plating with markings I didn't recognize, and something that made my blood freeze. What appeared to be the intact nose section of an aircraft, spinning slowly in the impossible underwater whirlpool. Jesus Christ. How long has this thing been collecting? Ivy screamed, as the revelation suddenly accelerated toward the vortex, spinning as we got caught in the outer edge of the current. The cabin filled with the sound of groaning metal and alarms, as our hull protested forces it was never designed to handle. Through the spinning chaos, I caught glimpses of other objects trapped in the same spiraling flow. Ships that looked like they belonged in maritime museums, their wooden hulls somehow intact despite what should have been decades or centuries underwater. Modern vessels with hull numbers I recognized from missing ship reports, and scattered among them, pieces of aircraft and equipment that had no business being 7 miles down in the Mariana Trench. "It's been taking things for years," Timothy shouted over the noise, still clutching his papers. "Decades, maybe longer." Dean was fighting to maintain control, but we were spinning faster now, pulled deeper into the vortex by currents that defied everything I knew about underwater physics. The pressure readings on our instruments jumped wildly between numbers that would crush us instantly and readings that suggested we were somehow at surface level. "The radio's dead," Chad reported, his voice cracking with panic. All communications are down. Timothy lunged for the radio anyway, shouting coordinates into the static. Base station, this is Expedition 7. We've found the anomaly at coordinates 11.373 degree N, 142.591 degree. Repeat, we have visual confirmation of the collection point. Who are you trying to contact? I demanded. People who've been tracking this thing for years. People who know what it is. The spinning was getting worse, and I could feel consciousness slipping away as the forces acting on our submersible exceeded anything the human body was meant to endure. Through the viewport, the vortex had become a tunnel of swirling water and impossible light, and I could see we were being pulled down into something that wasn't just deep ocean anymore. My last coherent thought before everything went black was that Timothy had known this would happen. He'd brought us here not to study some ancient structure, but to feed us to whatever was waiting at the bottom of that spiraling nightmare. The spinning stopped. Silence filled the revelation like a held breath, and when I opened my eyes, we were floating in crystal clear water under what looked like natural sunlight filtering down from somewhere impossibly far above. I came to with the strangest sensation, like waking up from a nightmare only to find yourself in a dream. The revelation bobbed gently on calm water, and through the viewport, I could see a pale blue sky stretching endlessly above us. No crushing darkness, no impossible pressure, just sky. What the hell? Dean's voice cracked as he stared at his instruments. We're at surface level, but look at this. The depth gauge still reads 30,000 feet. Timothy hunched over his classified materials, rifling through papers with shaking hands. Chad and Ivy pressed their faces to the viewports, both looking like they'd seen ghosts. This is impossible, Ivy whispered. We were miles down. The water around us was crystal clear, clearer than any ocean I'd ever seen. I could make out details hundreds of feet below, and what I saw made my stomach drop. Debris covered the seafloor like a graveyard, twisted metal, broken hulls, scattered pieces that looked like they came from ships, planes, and other submarines. Some of this stuff looks old, Ivy said, her voice barely audible. Really old. Timothy finally looked up from his papers. His face had gone pale. Carson wasn't just an archaeologist, he said quietly. He was part of a classified program. They've been studying dimensional anomalies in ocean trenches for years. 3 teams made it here before us. They all came back, but he trailed off. But what? I demanded. They were never the same. Chad's equipment started beeping. I'm picking up a signal northeast, maybe 2 miles out. Other survivors? Dean asked, already adjusting our heading. Could be equipment, could be anything. As Dean guided us through this bizarre underwater world, I couldn't stop staring at what we passed. Floating wreckage drifted by like ghosts. Wooden ships that looked centuries old. Military vessels I recognized from history books. Cargo containers with modern markings. A Viking longboat hung suspended in the clear water, its dragon head pointing toward the surface. A Spanish galleon sat tilted on the bottom, its sails long since rotted away. Timothy, I said, my voice low and dangerous. You knew about this place. You knew we might end up here. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Ivy gasped suddenly. Look at all of this. Ships from every era. It's like they've been collected. The signal grew stronger as we moved northeast. Through the pale light filtering down from above, I could make out something massive on the horizon. A ship, but bigger than anything we'd passed so far. Its silhouette stretched across the water like a floating mountain. That's where the signal's coming from, Chad said. Dean's hands tightened on the controls. Then that's where we're going. But as we got closer, the massive shape started looking familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. 4 smokestacks. A distinctive profile I'd seen in countless photographs and documentaries. The bow had that unmistakable rake, and even from this distance, I could make out the name painted in faded letters across the stern. "No way," Chad whispered. "That's not possible." The RMS Titanic sat on the surface of this impossible ocean, intact and floating as if it had never sunk. But something was wrong with it. The hull looked translucent in places, like it was made of glass instead of steel, and there was movement on the decks, tiny figures walking around, going about their business as if nothing had happened. "The Titanic sank in 1912, Ivy said, her voice shaking. "It's sitting on the ocean floor in the North Atlantic. I've seen the wreckage footage." Timothy was frantically shuffling through his papers again. Carson's research mentioned something about a collection point, a place where lost vessels end up, preserved somehow. Dean brought us closer, and the details became clearer. The ship's hull pulsed with a faint, sickly light that seemed to come from within the metal itself. The smokestacks were intact, but they weren't smoking. Instead, they seemed to be breathing, expanding and contracting like lungs. "The people on deck," Chad said, his voice barely a whisper. "They're moving wrong." He was right. The figures walking around the ship's deck moved with jerky, unnatural motions, like marionettes being controlled by someone who'd never seen a human walk before. Even from our distance, something about their movements made my stomach turn. "We need to get closer," Timothy said. "If Carson's theories were right, this ship might hold answers about what happened to the other expeditions. Or it might be a trap," I said. But Dean was already piloting us toward the Titanic's starboard side. As we approached, the figures on deck began to notice us. They stopped their strange, mechanical movements and turned in our direction. Even from 100 yards away, I could see their faces weren't quite right. "Jesus," Dean muttered. "What happened to them?" The people on deck were gathering at the rail now, pointing at us with fingers that seemed too long. Their skin had the same translucent quality as the ship's hull, and I could see dark shapes moving beneath the surface, veins, or something worse. One figure broke away from the group and approached the rail directly in front of us. It was a woman in what looked like an Edwardian dress, the kind passengers would have worn in 1912. But her face was all wrong, stretched and hollow, with eyes that reflected the pale light like mirrors. She pressed herself against the rail and opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her lips moved frantically, trying to tell us something urgent. "Can anyone read lips?" Timothy asked. The woman's movements became more desperate. She pointed at us, then at herself, then made a slashing motion across her throat. Other figures joined her at the rail, men in naval uniforms, women in period dress, even what looked like children. All of them had the same translucent skin, the same hollow eyes, the same desperate need to communicate something they couldn't say. "They're trying to warn us," Ivy said softly. The woman in the Edwardian dress pressed her face against what should have been empty air, but seemed solid to her, like there was glass between us and the ship. Her mouth moved again, more slowly this time, and I caught a few words. "She comes at night." Chad's instrument suddenly went crazy, alarms blaring as his biological sensors spiked beyond anything they were designed to measure. Massive life signs. Something huge is moving below us. The figures on the Titanic's deck scattered, running for cover with that same jerky, unnatural gait. The woman in the dress took one last look at us, her hollow eyes filled with what might have been pity, before she too fled into the ship's interior. The pale sky above us began to darken. The signal grew stronger as we approached the massive shape, and my stomach dropped as the details became clear. 4 smokestacks. That distinctive profile I'd seen in documentaries. The unmistakable rake of the bow cutting through water that shouldn't exist. "That's the Titanic," Chad whispered. But this wasn't the broken wreck sitting on the North Atlantic floor. This ship floated intact on the surface, its hull gleaming with that same sickly translucent glow we'd seen on the metallic structure below. Parts of the steel looked like glass, pulsing with veins of light that moved through the metal like blood through arteries. "Impossible," Ivy breathed. "The Titanic sank in 1912. It's been photographed on the ocean floor." Timothy was digging through his papers again, hands shaking as he found what he was looking for. Carson's research mentioned collection points, places where the entity gathers lost vessels and preserves them. He looked up, his face pale. He theorized that some ships don't actually sink, they get taken. Dean brought us closer, and I could see the ship wasn't just the Titanic anymore. Sections of other vessels had been grafted onto the hull, modern cargo containers welded to Victorian ironwork, what looked like pieces of wooden sailing ships merged seamlessly with steel plating. The whole thing pulsed like it was breathing. "Movement on deck," Dean reported. Through the pale light, I could make out figures walking around the ship's upper levels. From a distance, they looked human enough, but something about the way they moved made my skin crawl. Too jerky, too mechanical, like puppets being controlled by someone who'd never seen a person walk. "Bring us alongside," I said, "but keep the engines ready." As we got closer, the figures on deck noticed us. They stopped their strange movements and turned in our direction, gathering at the rail. What I saw made my blood freeze. They were human, or had been once. But their skin had that same see-through quality as the ship's hull, and I could see dark shapes moving underneath, veins or something worse. Their faces were stretched and hollow, eyes reflecting the pale light like mirrors. They wore clothing from different eras, naval uniforms, passenger dress from the early 1900s, modern work clothes, even what looked like medieval robes. "Jesus Christ," Dean muttered. "What happened to them?" Chad's instruments were going crazy. Massive biological activity. These things are alive, but the readings don't make sense. It's like they're caught between living and dead. The creatures pressed against the rail, pointing at us with fingers that seemed too long. Their mouths moved frantically, but no sound came through the water. One figure broke away from the group, a woman in an Edwardian dress, the kind wealthy passengers would have worn in 1912. She approached the rail directly in front of our viewport and pressed her face against what should have been empty water, but seemed solid to her. Her hollow eyes locked onto mine, and tears streamed down her transparent cheeks. Her mouth moved desperately, trying to tell us something urgent. "Can anyone read lips?" Timothy asked. More creatures joined her, men in naval uniforms from different centuries, women in clothing spanning decades, even what looked like children. All of them had the same translucent skin, the same hollow eyes, the same desperate need to communicate something they couldn't say. The woman in the dress pressed both hands against the invisible barrier between us, her mouth moving more slowly now. I caught fragments of words. "Don't. Stay. She comes." "They're trying to warn us," Ivy said softly. Timothy was frantically checking his files. Carson's notes mentioned collected souls, people taken by the entity and preserved in this dimensional pocket. But look at this. He theorized they gradually lose their humanity the longer they remain here. I studied the creatures more carefully and realized Timothy was right. Some looked more deteriorated than others. The woman in the 1912 dress still had recognizable human features, while others, further back on the deck, were barely recognizable as having once been people. The woman pressed her face closer to our viewport, her hollow eyes filled with what might have been pity. Her mouth moved again, and this time I understood clearly. "She comes at night." Chad's alarms started blaring. "Something massive is moving below us. Really massive." The creatures on deck suddenly scattered, running for cover with that same jerky, unnatural gait. The woman in the dress took one last look at us, her expression mixing desperation with resignation, before she too fled into the ship's interior. Above us, the pale sky began to darken. "Dean," I said, my voice tight, "we need to move. Now." But as he reached for the controls, more creatures appeared along the Titanic's hull. They weren't running anymore. They were climbing down toward us, their movements spider-like and wrong. Their hollow eyes reflected our lights as they descended, and I realized with growing horror that they weren't trying to escape whatever was coming. They were trying to escape with us. The creatures hit our hull with wet, slapping sounds that made the Revelation lurch sideways. I grabbed the nearest handhold as more figures swarmed over our viewports. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all clinging to our submersible with fingers that shouldn't have been able to grip smooth metal. "They're going to tip us over," Dean said, fighting to keep us level as the weight shifted our balance. The woman in the 1912 dress pressed herself against our main viewport, her hollow eyes wide with panic. Behind her, I could see others climbing down from the Titanic, sailors in uniforms from different centuries, passengers in everything from medieval robes to modern jeans, even what looked like Viking warriors with braided beards and leather armor. "How is this possible?" Chad whispered, staring at a figure in what appeared to be Roman centurion gear. "These people are from completely different time periods." "They're not trying to hurt us," Ivy said, watching their movements carefully. "Look at their faces. They're terrified." She was right. Every creature clinging to our hull had the same expression of desperate fear. The woman in the dress was mouthing words frantically, her transparent fingers tapping against the glass in urgent patterns. "Timothy," I said, "you're good with languages. What's she saying?" Timothy leaned forward, studying her lip movements. "She keeps repeating the same thing. She comes at night. She comes at night." More creatures pressed against our viewports, all trying to communicate at once. A sailor in what looked like a World War II naval uniform pointed downward repeatedly, then drew his finger across his throat. A woman in 1960s clothing held up both hands, showing 10 fingers, then made a cutting motion. "10 what?" Dean asked. 10 minutes? 10 hours? Chad was studying his instruments, his face pale. "The biological readings are off the charts, but look at this. Some of these creatures register as more deteriorated than others. The woman in the 1912 dress still shows significant human cellular structure, but that Viking guy barely registers as having been human at all. They lose more of themselves the longer they're here," Ivy said quietly. "Whatever this place does to people, it's gradual." The woman in the dress suddenly pressed her fingernail against the glass and started scratching. The sound made my teeth ache, but she kept going, carving letters into our viewport with supernatural strength. SHECOMESATNIGHT. Then she looked directly at me and mouthed one more word clear as day. "Run." Every creature on our hull suddenly released their grip at the same moment, dropping away from the Revelation like they'd been burned. They swam back toward the Titanic with that jerky, unnatural movement, disappearing into the ship's interior within seconds. The clear water around us began to change. What had been crystal blue started darkening to deep purple, then black. Above us, the pale sky shifted to an ominous twilight with no sun visible anywhere. "Dean," I said, "get us out of here, now." He reached for the controls, but his face went white. "Something's wrong. The engines are responding, but it's like we're moving through molasses." Chad's alarms started screaming. Massive biological activity below us. Something huge is rising from the bottom. Timothy was frantically digging through his papers, scattering documents across the cabin floor. Carson's final notes. Here, he mentions a queen entity that controls this dimensional pocket. She decides who stays and who goes. Well, we're going, I said. Dean, full power. I'm trying, but the water's fighting us. It's like it's gotten thick. Through the darkening water, I could see something moving in the depths below. Not swimming, rising. Something massive enough to displace the ocean around it, creating currents that pushed against our hull. How big is this thing? Ivy asked, her voice barely a whisper. Chad checked his readings. I can't get a full measurement. It's too large for my equipment to process. The water continued to thicken around us, and Dean's engines strained against the resistance. Whatever was coming up from the depths was changing the very nature of the ocean itself, turning it into something that didn't want to let us go. Timothy, I said, my voice tight with barely controlled panic. What else did Carson write about this queen? Timothy's hands shook as he found the right page. He said she's been collecting lost vessels for thousands of years. Ships, planes, anything that gets lost at sea. She brings them here and preserves them. He looked up, his face pale. Along with everyone on board. The darkness below us was taking shape now. Something serpentine and enormous, coiling upward through the black water. I caught glimpses of scales the size of buildings, movement that suggested intelligence and purpose. She's coming to meet us, Timothy said quietly. Dean pushed our engines beyond safe limits, but we barely moved through the increasingly viscous water. The revelation groaned under the strain, and I realized with growing horror that we weren't just trapped in this dimensional pocket. We were about to meet whatever ruled it. The thing that rose from the depths wasn't just massive, it was impossible. What started as serpentine movement in the black water below became something that made my brain hurt to process. Hundreds of feet of scaled body coiled upward through the darkness. But where I expected some prehistoric sea monster, the torso shifted into something almost human. Almost. The queen's face broke the surface 20 feet from our viewport, and I understood why the creatures on the Titanic had fled. She was beautiful in the way a poisonous flower is beautiful. Something that draws you in right before it kills you. Her features looked carved from pale marble, perfect except for the patches of rot that spread across her cheeks like dark veins. Hair flowed around her head like underwater weeds, moving independently of any current. But her eyes... Christ. Her eyes burned with an intelligence that had been watching the ocean for longer than human civilization had existed. Welcome to my collection. The words appeared in my head without her lips moving. Not heard. Felt like someone had reached into my skull and planted the thoughts there. Beside me, Chad made a choking sound and pressed his hands to his temples. She's in our heads, Ivy whispered. The queen's massive form shifted closer, her serpentine lower body creating currents that rocked the revelation. When she focused on Timothy, her expression changed to something like recognition. You carry the scent of one who sought me before, the one who called himself Carson. Timothy's face went white. Where is he? What did you do to my brother? Brother. The word hit me like a physical blow. Not just some researcher Timothy had been tracking, his actual brother. Carson Robinson is safe in my collection, as you will be. As you all will be. The Queen's voice in our minds carried the weight of absolute certainty. I have been gathering the lost for millennia. Ships that vanish in storms. Aircraft that disappear over deep water. souls who wander too far from the safety of shallow seas. Dean's hands moved over the controls, but when he tried to engage the engines, nothing happened. The water around us had become thick as syrup, holding the revelation in place like amber. "You cannot leave," the Queen continued, her rotting beauty filling our viewport. "But I offer you a choice that few receive. Join my collection willingly, and you may retain much of what you are. Resist and become as the others, preserved but empty, walking my vessels with no memory of the lives you once lived." Chad was hyperventilating, his instruments forgotten as he stared at the creature outside. "This isn't real. This can't be real." "Your friend Carson chose to resist," the Queen said, and I caught the hint of sadness in her mental voice. "He swims among my collection now, changed but not entirely lost. Perhaps seeing him will help you understand." The water around us shimmered, and through the murk I saw a figure approaching. Tall, thin, moving with that same jerky gait we'd seen from the creatures on the Titanic. As it got closer, Timothy made a sound like he'd been punched in the gut. The thing had been human once. Still was, in a way. But its skin had that same translucent quality as the others, and its eyes reflected our lights like mirrors. It wore the remnants of a diving suit that seemed to have partially merged with its flesh. "Carson," Timothy whispered. The creature that had been Carson Robinson pressed against our viewport, its hollow eyes focusing on Timothy with what might have been recognition. Its mouth moved soundlessly, trying to form words it could no longer speak. "He remembers you," the Queen said. "Love is the last thing to fade from my collection. It sustains them when everything else is gone." Timothy was crying now, tears streaming down his face as he pressed his hand against the glass where Carson's translucent fingers touched from the other side. "I came to find you," Timothy said. "I'm sorry I didn't believe your research. I'm sorry I let you go alone." Ivy was frantically digging through Timothy's scattered papers, her hands shaking as she searched for something. "There has to be a way out. Carson's notes. He must have found something." "The dimensional rift," Dean said suddenly. "The way we came in. If we can reach it." "I control the currents here," the Queen interrupted. "I decide who enters and who remains. You will not leave my collection." But Ivy had found what she was looking for. Here, Carson's electromagnetic frequency calculations. He theorized that specific wavelengths could disrupt the dimensional stability. She looked up at me, her eyes bright with desperate hope. "Our sonar array. If we overload it, create the right frequency, it could tear the revelation apart," Dean said. "Better than becoming one of those things," Chad whispered, staring at Carson's transformed face. The Queen's expression shifted to something like anger. "You would risk destruction rather than accept the peace I offer. The eternal preservation of your essence." Carson's figure suddenly became more animated, pressing both hands against our viewport and shaking his head frantically. Even transformed, even hollow, he was trying to warn us away from his fate. "He's telling us to run," Timothy said, his voice breaking. I looked at our instruments, at the sonar array that could either save us or kill us, at the Queen's massive form blocking our path to freedom, at Carson's desperate attempts to communicate across the barrier between human and something else. 22 years of deep-sea experience had taught me when to take calculated risks. This wasn't calculated. This was pure desperation. "Dean, when I overload the sonar, you punch those engines the second the water loosens up. Grayson, if the frequency's wrong, then we die as humans instead of living as whatever those things are." I reached for the sonar controls, my hands steady despite everything. The Queen's eyes locked onto mine, and I felt her presence pressing against my thoughts, trying to stop me. "You cannot escape what you have found," she said. "I am eternal. I am patient. I will have you all." "Maybe," I said, and slammed my fist down on the sonar overload. The sonar array exploded in a shower of sparks, and the most god-awful screech I'd ever heard. The electromagnetic pulse hit the Queen like a physical blow, and her perfect, rotting face contorted in what could only be agony. She writhed backward into the depths, her massive serpentine body thrashing through the water hard enough to send shockwaves through our hull. "It's working!" Ivy shouted over the chaos of alarms and sparking electronics. The dimensional pocket started coming apart around us. The pale sky above flickered between day and night like a broken light bulb, and the water churned so violently I thought we'd be torn to pieces. The Titanic in the distance tilted at impossible angles as the ocean itself seemed to forget which way was up. "Dean, now!" I yelled. He slammed the throttle forward, and for the first time in what felt like hours, the revelation actually moved. The water was still thick, but the Queen's control was slipping. Our engines screamed in protest, but we lurched forward through the chaos. "Where's the rift?" Dean asked, fighting to keep us level as dimensional turbulence threw us around like a toy. "Same direction we came from," I said, though with our navigation systems fried and the world spinning around us, I was mostly guessing. Timothy was hunched over his scattered papers, but he wasn't reading them anymore. He was staring at Carson's transformed figure, which was being swept away with dozens of other creatures as the dimensional currents went haywire. "Timothy," I said, "we need to know everything. Right now." He looked up at me and I saw something break in his face. "Carson's my brother. My twin brother. This whole mission, the government credentials, the official reports, I made it all up." The words hit me like cold water. "You're not government." "I'm a linguistics professor at Georgetown. Carson was the marine researcher. When he disappeared 3 years ago, I spent everything I had trying to find him. Sold my house, emptied my retirement, forged documents to get access to classified expedition reports." His voice cracked. "I couldn't let him stay lost." Chad was clinging to his instrument panel as we bounced through the churning water. "The rift. I'm getting readings. It's opening up about half a mile northeast." Through the chaos, I could see it. A tear in the water itself, showing the crushing black of the real ocean beyond. But it was shrinking fast, the edges pulling together like a healing wound. "We've got maybe 2 minutes before it closes," Chad said. The Queen's voice slammed back into our heads, no longer seductive but filled with rage. "You will not escape my collection." Her massive form erupted from the depths again. But she looked different now. The electromagnetic pulse had done real damage. Patches of her perfect skin were peeling away, revealing something dark and writhing underneath. Her beautiful face was twisted with fury, and when she opened her mouth, I saw rows of teeth like broken glass. Tentacles the size of subway cars burst from the water around us, reaching for the revelation with obvious intent to crush us flat. Dean threw us into a sharp turn, but our damaged systems couldn't handle the stress. Sparks flew from every panel, and the lights flickered. "The electromagnetic disruption's fading," Ivy said, working frantically at the ruined sonar controls. "I can't maintain it much longer." One of the Queen's tentacles slammed into our starboard side, and the hull groaned under the impact. Through the viewport, I could see the sucker-covered flesh pressing against our metal, searching for a grip that would let her tear us apart. "Dean, whatever you're going to do it now." He pushed our engines past every safety limit I'd ever heard of. The revelation shot forward through the churning water, leaving the Queen's grasping tentacle behind. But she was fast, impossibly fast, and I could see her massive form pursuing us through the dimensional chaos. The rift was 100 yards away, 50, 20. Timothy suddenly stood up, his face set with terrible determination. She wants the collection intact. If I give her what she came for, she might let you go. Timothy, no. But he was already moving toward the emergency airlock, his hands working the manual controls with surprising steadiness. Tell them Carson was right about everything. Tell them there are things in the deep ocean that humanity isn't ready to understand. Timothy, get away from that airlock. The Queen's tentacles wrapped around our hull, and I felt the metal start to buckle. Through the murky water, I could see Carson's transformed figure among the swirling chaos of displaced creatures, his hollow eyes fixed on our submersible with something that might have been recognition. Timothy looked back at us one last time. I'm sorry I lied to you all, but I'm not sorry I tried to save him. He hit the emergency release. The airlock blew open, and Timothy was sucked out into the churning water. I watched him tumble through the dimensional turbulence toward the Queen's waiting grasp, his body already starting to change as the pocket's influence took hold. The Queen's attention shifted to Timothy, her tentacles releasing our hull to reach for this new addition to her collection. In that moment of distraction, Dean gunned the engines one last time. We shot through the closing rift like a bullet, the dimensional pocket collapsing behind us as we plunged back into the bone-crushing darkness of the real Mariana Trench. The last thing I saw before the rift sealed was Carson's transformed face pressed against the dimensional barrier, his mouth moving in what might have been his brother's name. Then we were falling through 7 miles of black water, our emergency system screaming, racing toward the surface, and whatever was left of our lives. The revelation shot through the collapsing rift like we'd been fired from a cannon, and suddenly we were back in the real ocean, 7 miles of crushing black water above us, and emergency alarms screaming from every system we had left. The dimensional pocket sealed behind us with what felt like a thunderclap, leaving us tumbling through the abyss with half our electronics fried, and the other half throwing error codes I'd never seen before. Emergency ascent now, I told Dean, who was already working the ballast controls with hands that shook just enough to worry me. 18 hours minimum, he said, his voice tight. Life support's damaged but functional. We'll make it, but barely. Chad sat hunched over his ruined instruments, staring at readings that made no sense. The electromagnetic pulse fried everything. Sonar's dead. Communications are gone. Half the biological sensors are showing impossible data. He looked up at me with eyes that had seen too much. Grayson, what the hell just happened down there? I didn't have an answer that would make either of us feel better. Timothy was gone, sucked out into that nightmare realm to join his transformed brother. The Queen's collection had claimed 2 more souls, and we'd barely escaped with our lives. But something was wrong with Ivy. She pressed against the viewport, her face pale and her eyes unfocused. Can you hear that? She whispered. Hear what? I asked. She's calling. The Queen. She's saying my name. Ivy's breath fogged the glass as she leaned closer. She's not angry anymore. She understands why we ran, but she wants us to come back. Dean and I exchanged looks. Decompression psychosis was real, and exposure to whatever that dimensional pocket had been could have scrambled anyone's brain. But Ivy's voice carried a dreamy quality that made my skin crawl. Ivy, step away from the viewport, I said. She didn't move. Timothy's out there. I can see his face in the water. He's trying to tell me something. Chad twisted around to look where she was pointing. but there was nothing outside except the black water of the deep ocean. "Ivy, there's nothing there. You're not looking hard enough." She pressed both hands against the glass. "They're all out there. The Queen's collection. They're following us up." The ascent felt like it took forever. Our damaged systems groaned and sparked, and every hour brought new failures that Dean had to work around. But the worst part was watching Ivy deteriorate. She'd sit for hours staring out the viewports, carrying on conversations with people who weren't there. Sometimes she'd laugh at jokes only she could hear. Other times she'd cry and press her face against the glass like she was trying to push through it. "The Queen showed me something," she said during hour 12, her voice distant. "All those people on the Titanic, all the collected souls, they're not suffering. They found peace, perfect, eternal peace." "Ivy, that thing was a monster," Chad said. "You saw what it did to Carson. Carson chose to resist. That's why he changed so much. But the others, the ones who accepted their fate, they're beautiful now, translucent and perfect and free from all the pain of being human." I tried to keep her talking about normal things, her research, her family, anything to anchor her to reality, but she kept drifting back to the Queen and the collection, describing them with the kind of reverence that made my blood run cold. When we finally broke the surface after 18 hours of climbing through the dark, I'd never been so happy to see sunlight. Our support ship was waiting for us, having spent 36 hours searching after we'd lost contact. The crew pulled us aboard with relief and questions I wasn't ready to answer. The debrief was a nightmare. 3 officials in suits who listened to our story with the kind of polite skepticism reserved for people who'd obviously suffered some kind of breakdown. They nodded and took notes when I described the electromagnetic anomalies in the metallic structure. They started looking concerned when Chad talked about the dimensional pocket and the impossible physics. By the time I got to the Queen and her collection of transformed souls, they were exchanging glances that said everything about what they thought of our mental state. "Nitrogen narcosis can cause vivid hallucinations," one of them said. "Combined with the stress of equipment failures and the isolation of deep-sea work, it's not uncommon for experienced divers to report seeing impossible things." "We all saw the same impossible things," I said. "Shared delusions are well documented in high-stress situations." They confiscated Timothy's forged documents and what was left of our equipment, told us we'd be debriefed again once we'd had time to recover from our traumatic experience. The subtext was clear: keep quiet about the crazy stuff, and maybe we'd keep our careers. That night, while we were recovering in our quarters aboard the support ship, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the Queen's rotting beauty and Carson's hollow, transformed face. I kept thinking about Timothy's sacrifice and wondering if it had bought us anything more than a few extra hours of life. Around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps in the corridor outside my cabin. Soft, careful steps like someone trying not to wake anyone. I got up and cracked my door, just in time to see Ivy walking toward the deck stairs. She moved like she was sleepwalking, her eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. I followed her up to the main deck, where she stood at the rail staring down into the dark water. The ocean was calm, reflecting the stars like black glass. She was talking to herself or to someone, her voice too low for me to make out the words. "Ivy," I said softly. She turned to look at me and her eyes were different. Still her eyes, but with something else looking out through them. Something that had seen the Queen's realm and found it beautiful. "She's down there, Grayson, waiting for me. She says the collection isn't complete without all of us." Ivy smiled, and it was the most unsettling thing I'd ever seen. "She showed me what I could become. Translucent and perfect, free from all the doubt and fear and pain of being human. Ivy, step away from the rail. The Queen isn't a monster. She's a gardener, collecting beautiful things and preserving them forever. Timothy understands now. Carson understands. They're happy in ways they never could have been in the world above. I took a step toward her, but she held up a hand to stop me. I can hear them calling my name, all of them, singing together in harmony. The Queen's voice is the most beautiful sound I've ever heard. Ivy climbed up onto the rail, balancing on the narrow metal with perfect grace. She's offering me a choice, just like she offered all of you. I can go willingly and keep most of what I am, or I can resist and be changed into something else. Ivy, don't do this. She looked back at me one last time, her face serene in the starlight. Tell my parents I found something wonderful. Tell them I'm finally at peace. Before I could move, before I could shout for help, she stepped off the rail and disappeared into the black water below. I heard the splash, saw the ripples spreading outward in perfect circles, and then nothing. The search team spent 3 days looking for her body. Divers, sonar sweeps, everything they had. But I knew they wouldn't find anything. Ivy had gone home to join the Queen's collection, just like she'd wanted. Now I'm here in this medical facility, writing down everything that happened while the doctors talk about trauma response and decompression sickness. Chad's been committed to a psychiatric ward after he tried to convince a reporter that there were monsters in the Mariana Trench. They'll probably drum me out of service too, once they decide I'm too unstable for deep-sea work. I burned Timothy's forged documents like they asked me to, but I kept Carson's original research notes, the real ones hidden in Timothy's jacket. Someone else will come looking eventually. Someone else will be drawn to investigate that thing down in the deepest part of the ocean. And when they do, maybe they'll be smart enough to turn around and swim away.